"Open the safe and 50 million will be yours," joked a billionaire to a little girl living on the streets, but she surprised him in an unexpected way. When she managed to open the safe, secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story of redemption and love that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. The December sun mercilessly beat down on Fifth Avenue, turning the asphalt into an almost incandescent surface. The deafening noise of New York traffic blended with the buzz of people hurrying along the sidewalks, each immersed in their own world of commitments and ambitions. Among the mirrored skyscrapers reflecting the intense light, David Morgan adjusted the cuff of his Italian shirt and checked his Rolex Daytona. His driver was 15 minutes late. At 42, David was considered one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. His grayish-blue eyes had the cold gleam of someone used to making decisions that moved millions of dollars in seconds. The stubble on his face and the slightly graying brown hair at his temples gave him the appearance of a successful lone wolf. Dressed in an impeccable Hugo Boss suit, even in the scorching heat, he radiated a natural authority that made people instinctively step aside as he passed. The meeting had been exhausting. 3 hours discussing the expansion of his fintech business into Chile and Argentina, facing sharp questions from the board about the investment risks. David sighed heavily, feeling the weight of family expectations on his shoulders. His 2 adult children, Jake and Lily, heirs to a fortune estimated at $2 billion, questioned every strategic move, fearing any decision that could jeopardize the wealth built over 2 decades. Then he saw her. A girl of about 8 was sitting on the sidewalk near the entrance of a jewelry store, playing with a visibly patched-up doll. Her dark brown hair was tied in 2 messy braids, and she wore a faded pink t-shirt with shoes that had holes at the toes. The contrast between the child and the luxurious environment around her was striking, a small island of innocence amid an ocean of ostentatious wealth. David watched, fascinated, as she animatedly talked to the doll, creating different voices for each character in her imaginary play. There was something about the girl's absolute concentration, the way she completely ignored the frenetic movement around her, that sparked an inexplicable curiosity in the businessman. "Daddy, the lady in the store said there's a safe in there with a lot of money," the girl said to the doll, gesturing toward the jewelry store's window. "If I knew how to open safes, I would buy a big house for all the kids on the street to sleep warm." Unconsciously, David found himself approaching the girl. The sound of his Italian shoes on the concrete made her look up, 2 large brown eyes that sparkled with surprising intelligence for her age. "Hi, handsome," she said with a disarming smile, showing no shyness. "You look important. Do you work in those tall buildings?" David felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest. It had been years since he had spontaneously spoken to a child. Since his daughter Emily had died at 6 from leukemia, he had avoided any situation that could evoke painful memories. "I do work," he replied, surprised by his own patience. "And you? What are you doing here alone?" "I'm not alone," she pointed to a group of other kids playing further down, near a newsstand. "Aunt Sarah went to get our snacks from the charity. She always takes care of us." It was then that an absurd idea sprang to David's mind. Maybe it was the excessive heat, or perhaps the stress of the meeting, but he heard himself saying something completely out of character. "Do you see that safe inside the jewelry store?" He pointed to the window where an ornate safe was on display. "If you can open that safe, $50 million will be yours." The girl tilted her head, studying him with a disconcerting seriousness. For a moment, David thought she would laugh at the joke or simply ignore his provocation. Instead, she stood up, brushing the dust off her worn pants, and looked him straight in the eye. $50 million is a lot of money," she said, with a maturity that didn't match her age. "It could help a lot of people. I accept your challenge, but only if you promise one thing." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the turn in the conversation. What thing? If I manage to open the safe, you have to promise to help all the kids who live here on the street with me. There's Jake who doesn't have shoes, Lily who's always hungry, and little Max who gets sick all the time because he doesn't have medicine. The response hit David like a punch in the stomach. Here was an 8-year-old child living in precarious conditions, and her first concern was not for herself, but for other children in similar situations. He fell silent for long seconds, gazing into those brown eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Emily, but everyone calls me Emmy." She extended her small hand in a formal handshake. "And you?" "David." He shook her delicate hand, feeling strangely vulnerable. "David Morgan." The name meant nothing to the girl, which brought an unexpected relief to David. In recent years, he had rarely managed to have a genuine conversation without the person knowing exactly who he was and how much money he had. "So, Mr. David, do we have a deal?" Emmy extended her hand again. "I open the safe, win the 50 million, and you help my friends?" David hesitated. Part of him just wanted to... He wanted to retreat, return to his controlled world of spreadsheets and meetings, where unexpected emotions had no place. But there was something about that child, her natural generosity, her courage in the face of adversity, her refusal to accept the world as it was, that awakened a part of himself he believed he had buried, along with Sophia. "We have a deal," he finally said, shaking her small hand. At that moment, as the December sun continued to beat down on Fifth Avenue and traffic followed its frantic pace, neither of them imagined that this seemingly innocent game was about to completely transform their lives, revealing truths about family, purpose, and the true meaning of wealth. January arrived in New York City with its characteristic torrential rains, turning the streets into temporary rivers and bringing welcome relief from the sweltering summer heat. David Morgan couldn't get the encounter with the girl out of his mind. During the 3 weeks that followed the episode on Fifth Avenue, he found himself deliberately altering his daily route, hoping to run into her again, even though he wouldn't admit it to himself. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the light drizzle made the air feel fresher, that he finally found her again. Emmy was in front of a small building in Brooklyn, along with other children, all wearing blue T-shirts that read, "Hope Alive Charity." She recognized him immediately, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. David, did you come to take me to the vault?" she shouted, running toward him without caring about the splashes from the water pooling on the uneven sidewalks. Before David could respond, a female voice interrupted the meeting. "Emmy, how many times have I told you not to talk to strangers on the street?" David turned and saw a woman walking quickly toward them. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, with a few rebellious strands escaping the structure due to the humidity. She wore a slightly wrinkled white blouse and jeans, carrying a worn leather briefcase and a small umbrella. Her green eyes showed a mix of maternal concern and professional authority. "But Aunt Sarah, he's not a stranger," protested Emmy. "This is Mr. David, the man with $50 million that I told you about." The woman stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she assessed David from head to toe. The impeccable suit, the expensive watch, the shoes that cost more than many people earned in a month. All of it screamed privilege and power. "Sarah Johnson," she introduced herself with professional coldness, extending her hand in a formal manner. "I'm the social worker responsible for these children. I assume you're just another businessman trying to clear your conscience with charity for tax benefits." The rudeness of her approach caught David off guard. He was used to flattery, to people measuring every word in hopes of gaining some favor. Sarah's direct hostility was almost refreshing, though irritating. "David Morgan," he replied, shaking her hand more firmly than necessary. "And no, I'm not looking for tax benefits. I made a bet with Emmy." "A bet?" Sarah frowned, instinctively pulling the girl closer to her. What kind of responsible adult makes bets with 8-year-olds? The kind that challenges a brilliant child to show her potential, David retorted, feeling defensive. Did you see her math skills? Yesterday she solved a compound interest problem I presented using only her head. Sarah's expression shifted slightly. During the 6 months she had been caring for Emmy, she had noticed the girl's exceptional ability with numbers, but had never found resources to properly develop that talent. 50 million is a cruel game, she said, her voice heavy with bitterness. These children already face enough disappointments without adults feeding them impossible fantasies. Who said it's impossible? David pulled a business card from his pocket and extended it to Sarah. Morgan Holdings. Perhaps you've heard of it. Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. Of course, she knew the name. Anyone working in the non-profit sector in New York City knew it. David Morgan was a legend, the businessman who had built a financial empire from nothing. But he was also... You, she whispered, the color draining from her face. You're a partner at Morgan and Associates. Was, David corrected, puzzled by her sudden change in demeanor. My former partner passed away a few years ago. Why is that relevant? Sarah took a step back, as if she had been slapped. Her hands began to visibly tremble, and Emmy, sensing the tension, clung to her blouse. Aunt Sarah, what happened? You look pale, the girl said, worried. Edward Smith, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father, your former partner. David felt the world spin around him. Edward Smith had been his best friend since college, his partner in building the company, Sophia's godfather. His sudden death from a heart attack 5 years ago had left not only a personal void, but also a financial mess that David had never fully understood. Edward was your father. David felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He was, until your partnership with him led our family to ruin. Sarah spat the words with venom accumulated over the years. When Dad died, we discovered that you had made risky investments that left our family with a debt of $3 million. I lost my home, my private college, everything. I had to drop out of my psychology course to work and pay off the debts you created. David fell silent, processing the accusation. After Edward's death, he had stepped away from business for months, consumed by his own grief over the loss of Sophia, which had happened just 2 weeks later. When he returned, his accountant had explained that Edward had made some unauthorized investments that had gone wrong, but David had never investigated the details. He trusted. He was fully aware of his partner's situation. I didn't know, he finally said, his voice heavy with sincerity. Edward never told me about financial issues. If I had known... Save your excuses for someone who believes them, Sarah interrupted, taking Emmy's hand. Emmy, let's go. This man has nothing good to offer. But what about the safe? Protested Emmy, resisting the pull. Mr. David promised. Some adults make promises they don't intend to keep, Sarah said, casting a venomous glance at David. It's an important lesson you need to learn. David watched the two of them walk away, Sarah striding quickly, while Emmy looked back with confusion and sadness. For a moment he considered simply letting them go, returning to his orderly and controlled life. But something in the way Emmy had looked at him, not with disappointment but with an unwavering faith that he would keep his word, made him run after them. Sarah, wait, he shouted, catching up to them at the corner. You're right about your father. I owe you an explanation and a compensation, but don't punish Emmy for the mistakes of the past. Sarah turned, her green eyes shining with held-back tears. You think money solves everything, don't you? That you can buy forgiveness, absolution? No, David replied with brutal honesty. But I can try to do what's right. And doing what's right includes keeping a promise made to a child who deserves to see that there are still trustworthy adults in the world. The rain began to fall harder, forcing the three of them to take shelter under the awning of a bakery. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee mingled with the smell of rain on the pavement, creating an intimate atmosphere charged with unspoken emotions. "You really intend to let an 8-year-old try to open a real safe?" Sarah asked, her anger giving way to reluctant curiosity. "I intend to give her all the tools she needs to succeed," David replied. "And if she does, I intend to fulfill my part of the deal, including helping you understand what really happened with your father's finances." February arrived, bringing with it the typical humid heat of summer in New York and the contagious energy of Carnival. Greenwich Village transformed into a bubbling cauldron of colors, music, and joy, with street blocks occupying every corner. David couldn't focus on his business. Over the past 15 days, he had visited the Hope for Tomorrow charity 3 times, always with the excuse of assessing Emmy's mathematical potential. Indeed, the charity's headquarters operated in a renovated single-story house on Harmony Street, with faded yellow walls and a small garden in front where children played during breaks from activities. The place exuded simplicity and love. Donated furniture, old computers, but everything impeccably clean and organized. Sarah had turned that modest space into a genuine refuge for 15 vulnerable children. "Mr. David, look!" Emmy ran up to him holding a sheet of paper covered in numbers and calculations. "Aunt Sarah taught me about percentages, and I calculated if you really give me 50 million, I can help 2,500 children for 10 years. David examined the girl's calculations, impressed by her mathematical precision and touched by the generosity that motivated each number. In the background, he could hear Sarah talking on the phone in a tense tone. "Dr. Smith, you need to understand that we can't afford to pay the full fees right now. Yes, I know it's $3,000 overdue, but the children depend on this psychological support. Please give us 2 more weeks." When she hung up, David noticed how her shoulders slightly slumped. The weight of responsibility for so many small lives was clearly taking its toll. Over the past few weeks, he had observed how she worked tirelessly, arriving before 7 in the morning and leaving after 8 at night, always with a forced smile to avoid worrying the children. "Financial problems?" he asked, approaching her. Sarah discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. "Nothing that concerns you," she replied, but her voice betrayed her fatigue. $3,000, David said casually. "Is that what you owe the psychologist? How do you—" "Were you listening to my conversation?" Sarah turned to him, her green eyes blazing with indignation. "It's hard not to hear when you're talking 3 meters away." David pulled out his checkbook. "Let me help." "I don't want your charity." Sarah stomped her foot, crossing her arms. "I've already said I won't accept anything from you." "What if it wasn't charity?" David leaned against the wall, studying her. "What if it was an investment?" "Investment in what?" "In Emmy's education. Officially, I'll be paying for private math lessons for her. Unofficially, you'll use the money wherever you need it most." Sarah hesitated. Her integrity battled against practical necessity. There were 15 children depending on the charity, and pride didn't feed anyone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, lowering her guard for a moment. David looked out the window, watching Emmy teach basic calculations to the other children. "Because 5 years ago, I lost my daughter Lily. She would be about Emmy's age today. Maybe I'm trying to honor her memory by helping a child who has the same sparkle in her eyes that she had." The unexpected confession completely disarmed Sarah. For weeks, she had built an image of David as a cold, calculating businessman, but the genuine pain in his voice revealed a human vulnerability she hadn't expected to find. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "I didn't know. Few people know. I don't like to use pain as a bargaining chip for sympathy." David straightened up, returning to his professional posture. "So, will you accept the investment in Emmy's education?" Sarah reluctantly nodded, and David filled out the check. When she saw the amount, $15,000, her eyes widened. That's much more. What about $3,000? That's 5 months of private tutoring paid in advance, he explained with a half smile. Consider the interest for having to endure my presence here. It was at that moment that chaos began. The block of the alley, one of the most traditional carnival manifestations in Greenwich Village, had started its performance on the street in front of the charity organization. The deafening sound of drums, surdos and recos filled the air, mingling with the excited shouts of the costumed revelers. The children rushed to the window, mesmerized by the spectacle of colors and movement. "Can I see up close, Aunt Sarah? Please," Emmy pleaded, bouncing with excitement. "Just for 5 minutes, and don't leave the door," Sarah agreed, knowing the importance of carnival in the culture and not wanting to deprive the children of the experience. David watched from the window as Emmy blended in with the other kids on the sidewalk, all dazzled by the revelers passing in makeshift floats. There was something magical about how carnival temporarily dissolved social barriers. Rich and poor, children and adults, all united by music and collective joy. It was only 10 minutes of distraction. 10 minutes during which Sarah took an urgent call from City Hall about the charity's documentation, and David checked emails on his smartphone. When they looked back out the window, the other children were still there, but Emmy had vanished. "Where's Emmy?" Sarah asked, her voice rising an octave. "She was right here," shouted Jake, a 10-year-old boy. "She said she saw something interesting and ran after a man in a clown costume." Sarah's blood ran cold. In her 6 years working with vulnerable children, she had seen it all: child trafficking, abuse, kidnapping. The carnival crowd provided perfect cover for criminals with the worst intentions. "Emmy!" she shouted, running into the street, pushing her way through the revelers. "Emmy!" David immediately followed her, his business mind shifting into crisis mode. "You stay here with the other kids," he told Jake. "Sarah, we'll split up. You go right, I'll go left. If we don't find her in 15 minutes, we'll call the police." The desperate search through the alleys and back streets of Greenwich Village revealed a side of New York that David had never experienced. In the streets adjacent to the carnival, he found a complex network of homeless people who knew each other by name, shared information, and looked out for one another with a solidarity that deeply surprised him. "An 8-year-old girl with braided hair?" asked a woman in her 60s, sitting in front of a closed bakery. "I saw her running after a clown about 20 minutes ago. They went toward Potato Square." "Did she seem scared?" David asked, crouching to meet the woman's gaze. "No, sir. She looked determined, like she knew exactly where she was going." David ran toward Potato Square, his heart racing. In 20 years of business, he had faced financial crises, sabotage attempts, and political pressures, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer terror of a lost child under his care. That's when he heard her voice. "Mr. David, Aunt Sarah, I'm here." Emmy was in the center of a small crowd, animatedly talking to a man dressed as a clown, holding a sign. Magic Pete, entertainment for children's parties, specializing in magic safes. "Emmy!" David rushed over, closely followed by Sarah, who had heard the commotion. "Why did you run off like that? We were frantic." "Sorry, Mr. David," she said, showing no real remorse. "But look, Magic Pete knows how to open safes. He can teach me, and then I can try to open the jewelry store safe." The relief of finding her safe was so intense that David had to lean against a post. Sarah crouched down and hugged Emmy tightly, whispering words of relief and affectionate reprimand. "Next time, you let us know before you run off after strange clowns, okay?" David said, his voice still trembling. "I promise, Mr. David. But will you talk to Magic Pete?" David looked at the man in the costume, actually a gentleman in his 50s, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "Specializing in magic safes?" "Magic tricks, actually," the man explained. "But I've learned a few things about lock mechanics over the years. The girl told me about your bet. Interesting story." At that moment, As the music of the carnival continued in the background and the colorful crowd flowed around them, David realized that something fundamental had changed. The fear of losing Emmy had awakened a protective instinct in him that he hadn't felt in years. And by the way, Sarah looked at him, no longer with pure hostility, but with reluctant gratitude. He began to suspect that perhaps, just perhaps, that absurd bet was transforming into something much deeper and more meaningful than either of them had imagined. March arrived with its intensely hot afternoons and sudden rain showers, typical of the end of summer in New York. David had established a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he spent 2 hours at Hope for Tomorrow, officially supervising Emmy's private tutoring, but in practice observing the workings of that small universe of hope that Sarah had created. The yellow house on Harmony Street had become an unexpected refuge for him. Away from corporate pressures, the calculating gazes of partners, and the constant demands of his children, David found a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Emmy had become his personal project. He had brought advanced math books, imported logic games, and even a tablet so she could access online courses in basic programming. "Aunt Sarah, look!" Emmy ran to the table where Sarah was organizing documents, holding the tablet. "I learned how to make a program that calculates how many basic food baskets we can buy with different amounts of money." Sarah smiled, genuinely observing the simple codes that the girl had written. In recent weeks, the initial hostility towards David had given way to a respectful, almost friendly coexistence. She could no longer deny that his presence was positively transforming not only Emmy's life, but also the lives of all the children at the charity organization. "All right, sweetheart, show Mr. David what you learned about compound interest yesterday." David approached, adjusting the reading glasses he had recently started wearing. At 42, small signs of age were beginning to show, but there was something different about his appearance. His eyes seemed more alive, less burdened by the corporate coldness that characterized him. "Mr. David, if you invest $1 million at 12% per year, in 10 years you will have $3,100,000, Emmy announced proudly. And if you invest in education for underprivileged children, the social return is infinite." The girl's naive observation struck David like a revelation. For 2 decades, he had measured success solely in absolute numbers: revenue, profit margin, market value. But there, in that modest room, an 8-year-old was teaching him about a different kind of profitability. "Emmy, can I ask you a personal question?" David said, sitting down in the small plastic chair next to her. "Of course, you can ask anything. Do you remember how you got here? Where you came from before you met Aunt Sarah?" The question made Sarah look up from the documents, curious. In 6 months of caring for Emmy, she had never been able to extract clear information about the girl's past. The child spoke vaguely about before the street, but always changed the subject when pressed. Emmy was silent for a moment, her small fingers playing with the beaded bracelet she always wore. "I remember being in a very cold place, with a lot of noise from cars," she said slowly. "There was a very tall building, all made of glass, and I was sitting on the sidewalk with a cardboard box." David's heart raced. "A tall building, all made of glass?" "Yes, and there was a man in a suit who always passed by. He looked sad, always looking down. I wondered why he never smiled." David felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "Emmy, do you remember when this happened? What time of year was it?" "It was cold, but it wasn't raining." She closed her eyes, concentrating. "There were many colorful lights on the trees, as if it were a party. And I was very hungry." "December," David whispered. "You were there in December." Sarah noticed the change in his tone and moved closer. "David, what's happening? You look pale." David took his phone out of his pocket with trembling hands and showed Emmy a photo of the facade of the Montenegro Holdings building. "Was it this building?" Emmy's eyes lit up. "Yes, that one. Do you know that place?" "It's my building," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emmy, you were found in front of my building 8 years ago." "What a strange coincidence," Sarah murmured. But something in David's expression made her realize there was more to the story. David abruptly stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the jacaranda trees were blooming, their purple flowers carpeting the street with a melancholic beauty. "It wasn't a coincidence," he finally said. "Emmy, you were found on December 15th, 2016. "How can you be sure of the date?" Sarah asked. David turned to them, and the tears he had held back for years finally began to flow. "Because it was the day my daughter Lily died." The silence that followed was deafening. Only the distant noise of traffic from Greenwich Village and the sound of children playing in the small yard filled the emotionally charged atmosphere. "Lily had fought leukemia for 2 years," David continued, his voice choked. "She died at 3 in the afternoon on December 15th at the local hospital. I was so devastated that I couldn't even drive. I asked my driver to pick me up, and when he dropped me off at the building at 7 in the evening, I sat on the sidewalk and cried like a child." Emmy watched him with fascination, as if she were piecing together a complex puzzle in her mind. "I remember a man crying," she said softly. "He was sitting right next to me, but he didn't see me. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how." David's tears fell more intensely. "For years, I believed that God had taken my daughter to punish me for something. But now I'm starting to think that maybe he didn't take Lily away. Maybe he sent you." Sarah felt her own throat tighten with emotion. The coincidence was so extraordinary that it defied any logical explanation. Or perhaps it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was simply fate. "Mr. David," Emmy said, getting up from her chair and walking over to him, "you don't have to be sad anymore. Lily must be happy in heaven knowing that you're taking care of me." David crouched down and hugged the girl with desperate strength, as if she could disappear at any moment. "Emmy, can I ask you a very important question?" "Of course. If I could officially adopt you, if you could truly be my daughter, would you like that?" The question surprised both Emmy and Sarah. The girl stepped back a little, studying David's face with her characteristic maturity. "But I already have Aunt Sarah," she finally said. "She takes care of me every day. If I become your daughter, will she be alone?" David looked at Sarah, who was clearly struggling with her own emotions. In recent months, she had genuinely grown attached to Emmy, and the thought of losing her was terrifying. "What if Aunt Sarah came with us?" David suggested impulsively. "What if you both, between the adults with genuine interest?" "Aunt Sarah, if Mr. David were our dad, would that mean I would have a real family?" The innocent question broke down Sarah's last defenses. Throughout her adult life, she had sacrificed for others, first for her workaholic parents, then for the children at the charity organization. The possibility of someone wanting to take care of her, to form a non-traditional but real family, was a dream she didn't allow herself to have. "Yes, my dear, it would mean that," she said, her voice choked. "It would mean we would have a very special family." David felt as if a 5-year weight had been lifted from his shoulders. There, in that modest room in Greenwich Village, with the smell of fresh coffee coming from the small kitchen and the sound of children playing in the yard, he had found something that all his money could never buy: a true home. "So it's decided," Emmy announced with all the authority her 8 years allowed, "but I still want to open that safe. A promise is a promise." David laughed through his tears. "A promise is a promise," he agreed, "and I intend to keep every word." Outside, the first stars began to appear in the purple sky of the evening, silently witnessing the moment when 3 lonely lives came together to form something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined alone. April arrived with its sunny days and cool nights, marking the beginning of autumn in the city. David had spent the last 2 weeks reorganizing his personal and professional life, preparing to formalize Emmy's adoption and make his relationship with Sarah official. However, when he called an extraordinary family meeting to communicate his intentions, he discovered that not all changes would be received with enthusiasm. The office on the 42nd floor of the Morgan Holdings building offered a panoramic view of the city, with its skyscrapers stretching to the horizon like a concrete and glass urban forest. The solid mahogany conference table, which had witnessed billion-dollar decisions over the years, was now to become the setting for a family confrontation that would forever change the dynamics of the Morgan family. Edward Morgan Jr., 26 years old, was a younger and more ambitious version of David. A graduate in business administration from Harvard, he had joined the family business with the determination to expand the financial empire even further. His perfectly styled dark hair, impeccable Armani suit, and Patek Philippe watch demonstrated his dedication to appearances and social status. Lily Morgan, 24 years old, had chosen a different path. A law graduate from UCLA, she specialized in corporate law and served as the legal advisor for the family holding. Her platinum blonde hair, always tied in a strict bun, and her austere women's suits reflected her controlling and meticulous personality. "Dad, is this meeting about the expansion into Chile?" Edward asked, checking his schedule on his iPhone. "Because I have an important lunch with representatives from Santander at 1:30 p.m. "No, Edward. It's about changes in my personal life that will directly affect our family structure." David took a deep breath, preparing for the storm that was to come. "I intend to adopt an 8-year-old child and marry her adoptive mother." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Edward paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth, while Lily dropped the pen she had been using on the documents she was reviewing. "You're joking, right?" Lily finally said, her voice laden with disbelief. "Dad, you're 42. You went through a tough time after Lily's death, but that doesn't mean you need to replace her with some random kid from the street." "Emmy is not some random kid from the street," David replied firmly, feeling anger rising. "She is an extraordinary girl, with impressive intellectual potential and a kindness that you both would do well to learn." Edward recovered from the initial shock and assumed his corporate posture. "Dad, I understand that you're going through an existential crisis, but we need to be practical. Adopting at 42, marrying what is her profession again?" "Social worker," David replied dryly. "A social worker," Edward continued with disdain. "Dad, do you realize how this will affect our corporate image, our international investors, our position in the social circles of the city?" "Our position in social circles." David stood up abruptly, his patience wearing thin. "Edward, when did you become so concerned with appearances that you forgot to be human?" Lily intervened, taking on her lawyer tone. "Dad, we're not questioning your humanity. We're questioning your financial decisions. Are you aware that a new wife would have legal rights over our assets, and an adopted daughter would become an automatic heir?" The question revealed the true fear of David's children. It wasn't concern for his happiness, but terror that their billion-dollar inheritance would be diluted. "You are worried about money," David said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your own children are worried that I might find happiness because it could affect your bank accounts." "It's not just about money," David exploded, rising from his chair. "It's about responsibility. You have employees who depend on your decisions, shareholders who trusted you, a family legacy we've built together." "Legacy?" Edward laughed bitterly. "What legacy, David? A pile of money accumulated in offshore accounts? Buildings with our name? That's not a legacy. That's vanity." Lily pulled a folder of documents from her Louis Vuitton bag. "Dad, I took the liberty of consulting our legal department about the implications of adoption at your age. There are complex succession issues that need to be considered." "You investigated my personal life behind my back." David felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "It's my job to protect the family's interests," Lily replied coldly. "And frankly, Your recent decisions suggest you're not thinking clearly. The accusation hit David like a slap. For 20 years, he had sacrificed his health, relationships, and happiness to build the empire that now guaranteed his children's luxurious future. And they were questioning his mental sanity because he had finally found something that made him genuinely happy. "Do you want to know the truth?" David said, walking to the panoramic window. "In the last 2 months, with Emmy and Sarah, I have been happier than in the last 5 years. I rediscovered what it means to have a purpose beyond accumulating wealth." "Purpose?" Edward laughed sarcastically. "Dad, our purpose is to maintain and expand what you built. It's to ensure that the Morgan family remains influential for generations. And what good is it to be influential if we don't use that influence to do good?" David retorted. "Do you know how many children live on the streets of São Paulo? More than 15,000. Do you know how much we spend a month on imported wines? Enough to feed 300 families." Lily sighed dramatically. "Dad, no one is saying you can't do charity. We have the Morgan Foundation just for that. But there's a difference between helping professionally and getting emotionally involved to the point of adopting children and marrying people from different social classes." The prejudiced remark was the last straw. David turned to his children, and they saw in his eyes a determination they knew well, the same one he showed when making irrevocable business decisions. "Very well," he said with a dangerous calm. "Since you are so concerned about the family legacy, I'll make things easier. Starting tomorrow, you two will take full control of Morgan Holdings operations." "Dad, what are you saying?" Edward asked, alarmed. "I'm saying I'm stepping down from the CEO position." "You want total control over financial decisions. Now you have it. But in return, I want complete freedom to live my personal life as I choose." Lily quickly stood up. "You can't be serious. Retiring at 42? Why not? I have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, even if I donate 90% of what I own." David walked to the door. "And that's exactly what I intend to do." "Dad, wait," Edward shouted. "We can talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" David paused at the doorframe. "Edward, Lily, I love you unconditionally. You are my children and always will be. But I will not allow you to emotionally blackmail me into giving up the first real chance at happiness I've had in 5 years." "And if we refuse to take over the company?" Lily asked in a last-ditch attempt at manipulation. David smiled sadly. "Then I will sell everything and donate the money to charity organizations. You choose. Run a billion-dollar empire, or explain to your future children why their grandfather preferred to donate the entire family fortune rather than accept emotional blackmail." The threat was real, and the children knew it. David Morgan never made empty threats. When he made a decision, he followed through to the end. "Dad," Edward said, his arrogance giving way to desperation, "would you really do that? Destroy everything we've built for a child you've known for 2 months?" David looked one last time at the office that had been his second home for 2 decades. "Edward, I'm not destroying anything. I'm finally building something that truly matters, a family based on love, not money." As the elevator doors closed behind him, David felt an immense weight lifted from his shoulders. Outside, the autumn air painted the trees with golden hues, and for the first time in years, the future seemed bright and full of infinite possibilities. Emmy was waiting for him at the charity organization with a new drawing, a family of 3 holding hands in front of a yellow house. "For our new beginning, Mr. David," she said, handing him the paper. David hugged the girl, knowing he had made the most difficult and right decision of his life. June arrived in New York, bringing with it the pleasant chill of winter and the unmistakable aroma of summer fairs. Greenwich Village transformed into a melting pot of traditions, with colorful flags adorning the streets and the smell of hot apple cider, peanut candy, and roasted corn wafting from every corner. The Hope for Tomorrow had decided to organize its first summer fair as a way to raise funds and integrate the local community. David had spent the last few weeks on an emotional roller coaster. The break with Edward and Lily had been more painful than he had imagined. His children had taken control of the company, but completely severed personal contact with him. The only communications were through lawyers, cold and impersonal, like business contracts. "Mr. David, look how beautiful it turned out." Emmy ran to him, holding a blue and red checkered dress. Sarah had spent weeks sewing outfits for all the children at the fair, transforming donated scraps into charming costumes. "Aunt Sarah said you will also dress up for the fair." David examined the outfit Sarah had prepared for him. Checkered pants, a cream cotton shirt and a straw hat. It was simple, unpretentious, completely different from He wore Italian suits for 20 years. And yet, when he looked in the makeshift mirror of the charity organization, he saw a man who looked more alive and authentic than he had ever felt. "How do I look?" he asked, turning to show off the full outfit. "Perfect for square dancing!" exclaimed Emmy, clapping her hands. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a huge pot of hot apple cider, her loose, wavy brown hair flowing, wearing a country dress that she had sewn herself. The floral fabric accentuated her green eyes, and for the first time since he had met her, David saw her completely relaxed and smiling. "You look stunning," he said, stepping closer to her. "It's just an old dress," Sarah replied, blushing slightly, but her eyes sparkled with genuine happiness. The backyard of the charity organization had been transformed into a real summer fair. Lights twinkled among the trees, makeshift stalls offered typical treats prepared by the children themselves, and a small bonfire crackled in the center of the space, creating a magical and welcoming atmosphere. Neighbors from Greenwich Village had joined the celebration, bringing their families and contributions, creating a genuinely communal gathering. "David," Sarah gently touched his arm, "we need to talk about something important." He noticed the seriousness in her voice and followed her to a more secluded corner of the yard, where a small wooden table was decorated with bunting and candles. "It's about Edward and Lily, isn't it?" David asked, bracing himself for another difficult conversation about the situation with the kids. "No, it's about my father." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "David, I need to tell you the whole truth about what happened between you two." David felt his stomach tighten. For months, that wound had remained open between them, a ghost from the past, overshadowing any possibility of a genuine future. "In the past few weeks, I've been investigating the documents left from my father's business," Sarah continued, pulling out a crumpled folder from her bag, "and I found something that will shock you as much as it shocked me." She opened the folder, revealing bank statements, contracts, and correspondence dated 5 years ago. "My father really did make risky investments, as you were informed, but he didn't do it alone, and it wasn't with your approval." David took the documents, analyzing them under the soft candlelight. His eyebrows furrowed as he absorbed the information. "This is the name of the accountant who managed the company's finances at the time." Sarah pointed to a repeated signature on several documents. "Mark Sanders. He convinced my father that you had verbally authorized the investments, but he never documented anything officially." "Mark," David whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "He still works for the company. In fact, he is now the chief accountant promoted by my children." "There's more." Sarah turned the pages, showing bank transfers. "Mark embezzled $2 million from the investments into personal accounts. When my father found out and threatened to report him, Mark manipulated the books to make it look like my father was solely responsible for the losses." David felt as if he had been struck by lightning. For 5 years, he had carried the guilt for the financial ruin of his best friend, when in reality, Edward had been a victim of the same corruption scheme. "Sarah, why didn't you show me this before?" She lowered her eyes, clearly struggling with emotion. "Because part of me wanted to keep blaming you. It was easier to have a specific villain than to accept that my father was simply deceived by someone he trusted. The sound of country music and children's laughter continued in the background, creating a surreal contrast with the intensity of the conversation. David reached out and gently touched Sarah's face. "We both lost Edward to someone else's greed," he said. "But that doesn't mean we need to lose each other." "There's one more thing," Sarah hesitated. "Mark is still embezzling money. I found evidence that he has been manipulating the accounts of Montenegro Holdings for years. Your children may not know, but they are being systematically robbed." David fell silent, processing the information. Despite all the recent hurt, Edward and Lily were still his children. He couldn't simply ignore the fact that they were being deceived by the same man who had destroyed Edward Smith's life. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to fight," Sarah said with determination. "Not for the company, not for the money, but for justice. My father deserves to have his name cleared, and your children deserve to know the truth about the man they are trusting." It was at that moment that Emmy came running in, interrupting the serious conversation. "Aunt Sarah, Mr. David, the square dance is about to start. You promised to dance with me." David and Sarah exchanged glances, both recognizing that this conversation had fundamentally changed the dynamic of their relationship. It was no longer just about overcoming the past. It was about building a future based on truth and justice. "Let's dance," David said, extending his arm to Sarah. "Then we'll deal with the ghosts." The square dance that followed was a moment of pure magic. David, who had spent decades at formal corporate events, discovered the simple joy of dancing in a backyard decorated with homemade bunting. Sarah laughed genuinely for the first time in months, her fears and resentments temporarily forgotten. And Emmy, at the center of it all, radiated a contagious happiness that reminded everyone present why traditions like this existed, to celebrate life, community, and love in its purest forms. When the music stopped and the children gathered around the bonfire to listen to stories, David realized he was living one of the happiest moments of his adult life. There, surrounded by people who loved him for who he was, not for what he owned, he finally understood what Lily had tried to teach him in her final days. Happiness was not in conquering the world, but in finding his place in it. "Sarah," he whispered as they watched Emmy tell a story about as magical safes for the other kids. "I love you." The words came out naturally, without planning or hesitation. Sarah turned to him, her green eyes shining in the firelight. "I love you too," she replied, sealing the confession with a soft kiss that tasted of hot apple cider and promises of the future. Emmy, noticing the romantic moment, shouted from across the yard, "Yay! Now we are officially a family." The collective laughter that followed echoed through Greenwich Village, blending with the music from other summer fairs and creating an urban symphony of joy and hope. David knew that difficult challenges awaited them, but for the first time in years, he was convinced that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. July arrived in New York with its characteristic dry cold, turning the mornings into crystal-clear moments where the steam of breath mingled with the aroma of strong coffee wafting from the bakeries in Greenwich Village. David had spent the last 2 weeks gathering evidence about the irregularities of Mark Sanders, preparing for a confrontation that could either destroy or definitively rebuild his relationship with Edward and Lily. The Hope for Tomorrow charity organization had become his makeshift headquarters. On the table in the small meeting room, documents, bank statements, and audit reports were spread out like pieces of a complex puzzle. Sarah worked alongside him, her legal training being essential in organizing the evidence in a legally solid manner. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of bank transfers. "Mark created 3 shell companies in the last 2 years. All receive consulting payments from Morgan Holdings, but none of them have employees or a real address." David examined the documents with a mix of admiration and indignation. The sophistication of the scheme was impressive. Mark had built a complex web of corruption that drained approximately $500,000 monthly from the company, a significant amount even for a billion-dollar corporation. The most serious part, Sarah continued, is that the approval signatures on these transfers are from your children. Mark convinced them that they were legitimate strategic investments. The revelation hit David like a punch to the gut. Edward and Lily were not complicit in the corruption. They were its victims, just as Camilla's father had been 5 years ago. "Emmy, come here for a second," David called. The girl was in the yard teaching basic math to the other kids, using pebbles and leaves as teaching materials. "Yes, Mr. Morgan?" She ran to him, her brown eyes shining with curiosity. "I need to make a very difficult decision. Do you remember when you told me about always helping your friends, even when they are not nice to you?" Emmy nodded gravely. "Aunt Sarah says we should do what is right, not what is easy." "Exactly. My children are angry with me right now, but they are being deceived by a bad person. Should I help them, even knowing they might not thank me?" The question made Emmy furrow her brow in concentration. At 8 years old, she had already developed a practical wisdom about human relationships that impressed the adults around her. "Mr. Morgan, if someone was hurting Aunt Sarah and she didn't know, wouldn't you tell her?" The simplicity of the child's logic cut through all the emotional complexities of the situation. Of course, he would protect Sarah, regardless of whether she was angry with him or not. Paternal love should work the same way. "You are right, Princess. I will help them." David picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in weeks. The voice that answered was cold and formal. "Edward Morgan." "Edward, it's me. I need to talk to you and Lily. It's about the company." "Dad, if it's to try to convince us to reverse your decisions about adoption and marriage, we are not interested in... It's about Mark Sanders stealing $500,000 a month from you." The silence that followed was long enough for David to hear the hum of the air conditioning in his son's office. "What are you talking about?" Edward's voice had lost all hostility, replaced by genuine alarm. "Schedule a meeting for today at 4 p.m. at the office. Bring Mark along. And, Edward, hire an independent auditor to be present. You will need it." The meeting took place in the same conference room where David had announced his retirement 6 weeks earlier. This time, however, the tension in the air was different, no longer familiar, but professional and dangerous. Mark Sanders had aged well in recent years. At 55, his perfectly styled grey hair and always impeccable suits projected an image of competence and reliability. He greeted David with a professional smile, but something in his eyes betrayed nervousness. "David, what a pleasure to see you. I heard you are dedicating yourself to philanthropic activities. Very noble. Let's just say I'm dedicated to uncovering the truth about some past activities," David replied, sitting directly across from the accountant. Edward and Lily entered accompanied by Dr. Helen Carter, a forensic auditor of impeccable reputation. Her presence made Mark visibly squirm in his chair. "Dad, we hope you have solid evidence for these accusations," Lily said, taking on her lawyer tone. "Mark has been our accountant for 12 years. We know his integrity." "Do you really?" David opened a folder, spreading documents across the table. "Mark, can you explain to my children what these 3 companies are that receive monthly payments from Morgan Holdings?" The color drained from Mark's face. He picked up the documents with visibly trembling hands, pretending to analyze them for the first time. They are specialized consultancies we hired for market analysis." "Market analysis?" David smiled coldly. "Dr. Helen, could you tell us what you found when you tried to locate these companies?" The auditor opened her folder. "None of the 3 companies has a real physical headquarters. The listed addresses correspond to vacant lots or commercial establishments that deny any knowledge of them. Furthermore, there is no record of employees, equipment, or effective service provision." "Edward, He abruptly stood up. "Mark, what's going on here?" There must be some mistake." Mark stammered, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "The only mistake," Raphael interjected, "was trusting someone who had stolen before." He turned to his children. "Edward, Lily, Mark didn't just ruin my partnership with Edward Smith. He has been doing the same thing to you for years." Raphael then recounted the entire story, how Mark had manipulated Sarah's father, how he had forged authorizations, how he had embezzled millions over the years. With each revelation, his children's expressions shifted from skepticism to horror, and finally to a cold, calculated anger. "Mark," Lily said in a dangerously calm voice, "you have exactly 5 minutes to explain before I call the FBI." The accountant finally broke down. I needed the money. My daughter was sick, the treatments were expensive. It started small, just a few thousand, and I always planned to pay it back." "Pay it back?" Edward exploded. "You've stolen over $15 million over the years, and destroyed an entire family's life in the process," Raphael added, thinking about how Sarah had suffered because of Mark's lies. The full confession took 3 hours. By the end, Mark had admitted not only to the recent embezzlements, but also his responsibility for the false accusation against Edward Smith. Edward and Lily were visibly shaken, not just by the financial betrayal, but by the realization of how they had misjudged their father. "Dad," Edward said as Mark was taken away by security to await the police, We owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing," Raphael replied. "You were deceived by a professional. It happens to the best of us." Lily, for the first time in weeks, let her professional armor down. "Dad, we were terrible to you. About Emmy, about Sarah. We judged without knowing." Raphael looked at his children, seeing in them no longer the hard-nosed business people they had become, but the vulnerable, confused children they once were, needing paternal guidance. "Do you want to meet them?" he asked gently. "To really get to know them, not just judge." Edward and Lily exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between siblings. Finally, Edward nodded. "We would love to, Dad. We would like to meet our new sister." When Raphael arrived at the charity organization that night, he carried more than just the satisfaction of having achieved justice. He carried the possibility of a reunited family, built not on money or obligation, but on forgiveness, understanding, and genuine love. Emmy greeted him with her usual radiant smile. "So, Mr. Raphael, did you do the right thing?" "I did, Princess. And you're going to meet your older sibling soon." The happiness that shone in Emmy's eyes at that moment was worth more than all the bills Raphael had accumulated over 2 decades of work. August arrived in New York City with its chilly mornings and sunny afternoons, creating a thermal contrast that perfectly mirrored the conflicting emotions hovering over the Morgan family. Raphael had spent 2 weeks meticulously organizing a meeting between his biological children and his new family, Sarah and Emmy. The tension was palpable, but there was also a genuine hope for reconciliation floating in the air, like the morning mist covering the city. The chosen location for the meeting was carefully planned. Neither the intimidating formality of a corporate office nor the excessive simplicity of the charity organization, but Raphael's apartment in the Upper East Side, a neutral middle ground that could accommodate both worlds, about to collide. Raphael's triplex apartment occupied the top floors of a modern building, with a panoramic view of Central Park. The minimalist decor, in shades of grey and white, punctuated by a few pieces of contemporary art, reflected his controlled personality of recent years. However, in the past few weeks, small changes had appeared. Emmy's drawings stuck to the refrigerator, children's books scattered across the coffee table, and a subtle aroma of homemade coffee replacing the impersonal scent of automatic diffusers. Mr. Raphael, are they going to like me? Emmy asked for the 10th time, nervously adjusting the navy blue dress that Sarah had specially bought for the occasion. Her hair was styled in neat braids, and she held a small folder where she had kept her best drawings and math exercises. "They're going to adore you, Princess," Raphael replied, kneeling to meet her eye level. "But remember, you don't need to impress anyone. You are perfect just the way you are." Sarah watched their interaction while finishing arranging a tray with chocolate truffles she had made that morning, a reminder of her Brazilian childhood that she hoped would break the initial ice. She wore a discreet wine-colored dress and carried the weight of representing the world from which Emmy came. "What if they asked me about my past?" Sarah confessed her anxiety to Raphael while Emmy was distracted organizing her drawings. "What if they think I'm just an opportunist trying to take advantage of your fortune?" Raphael took her hands, feeling them cold despite the warmth of the apartment. "Then they will know the truth about who you really are. And if they still think poorly after that, the problem will be theirs, not yours." The doorbell rang precisely at 3 p.m., a punctuality that Raphael recognized as a family trait. Edward and Lily entered carrying wrapped gifts and expressions of carefully controlled nervousness. Edward wore a casual blazer over a dress shirt without a tie, a clear attempt to appear less formal. Lily had abandoned her severe suit in favor of a silk blouse and dress pants, her hair down creating a softer appearance. "Dad," Edward greeted Raphael with a hesitant hug, then turned to Sarah. "You must be Sarah. I'm Edward, and this is my sister Lily." "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Sarah replied, extending her hand with natural elegance. "Raphael talks a lot about you." "And this," Raphael turned to Emmy, who had shyly hidden behind Sarah, "is Emily, but everyone calls her Emmy." The girl slowly emerged, her large brown eyes studying the two young adults with scientific curiosity. "Are you my older siblings?" she asked directly, with the brutal honesty characteristic of children. Lily knelt down to be at Emmy's level, a genuine smile softening her usually serious features. "We are, and we brought some gifts for you to see." "Gifts?" Emmy's eyes lit up, but she looked to Sarah for approval before approaching. Edward opened the first package, revealing a sophisticated doll, still in the box, with interchangeable clothes and accessories. "I thought you might like it." So Emmy examined the doll with interest, but then looked at the patched rag doll she had brought with her. "It's very pretty, thank you. But this one is my best friend." She held the old doll tenderly. Aunt Sarah sewed the patches when she was hurt. The girl's sincere response touched Lily more deeply than she expected. There was a loyalty and gratitude in the child that contrasted with the superficiality of the social circles she was used to. "And this," Lily opened her gift, "is a tablet with educational games. Dad told us that you love math." "Really?" Emmy took the device with reverence but immediately turned to David. "Mr. David, can I share it with the other kids at the charity?" The spontaneous question about sharing visibly surprised Edward. In his social circles, gifts were symbols of individual status, not community resources. "Of course you can, Princess. But first, how about showing your siblings some of the exercises you've been doing?" Emmy ran to get her folder, and the next 15 minutes turned into an impressive demonstration of intellectual capability. She showed complex calculations, solved logic problems, and even some basic programming concepts she had learned. "Emmy," Edward said, genuinely impressed, "you're 8 years old and already understand concepts I only learned in college." "Aunt Sarah says my brain is like a very fast computer," Emmy replied proudly. "But Mr. David says the most important thing is not to be smart, but to be kind." The observation created a moment of reflective silence. Lily looked at her father, seeing in him a fundamental change. The ruthless businessman had given way to a man who valued character over accomplishments. "Sarah," Lily said, breaking the silence, "I would like to know more about your work at the charity. Dad told us that you help many children. What followed was a 2-hour conversation where social barriers gradually crumbled. Sarah spoke about the challenges of the third sector, about children who had transformed their lives despite adverse circumstances, about the satisfaction of seeing human potential being developed regardless of social class. Edward, initially skeptical, found himself asking increasingly engaged questions about the financial sustainability of charities, about public policies for vulnerable children, about how businesses could contribute more effectively to social issues. "You know," he finally said, "at Morgan Holdings we have a corporate social responsibility program, but it always seemed more like marketing than real impact. Could you help us make it more meaningful?" The question surprised Sarah. "Are you really interested in making a difference, or just in improving corporate image?" Edward hesitated, then smiled with rare honesty. "Honestly, I started out concerned about image, but listening to you speak, seeing Emmy, I think I want to learn how to make a real difference." Lily nodded in agreement. "Me too. I spent years focused only on legal and financial aspects. I forgot that behind every number there is a person." Emmy, who had been playing with the new doll while listening to the adults' conversation, suddenly stood up and walked over to Edward and Lily. "Do you want to see my whole family?" she asked, extending her old smartphone. The photos she showed were an improvised album of life at the charity, children playing, studying, sharing simple meals. But what impressed Edward and Lily the most was how Emmy described each child by name, knew their individual stories, celebrated their small achievements. "This is Julia," she pointed to a girl about 6 years old. "She couldn't read when she arrived, but now she reads whole books. And this is Max. He's learning to play the guitar with a volunteer." "Emmy," Lily asked gently, "do you miss anything from your old life?" The girl considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I feel cold at night and remember when I slept on the street, but now I have Aunt Sarah covering me and Mr. David teaching me new things, and you who are my siblings. I think I have everything a person could want." The profound simplicity of the answer touched something fundamental in Edward and Lily's hearts. Here was a child who had experienced real deprivation, but now radiated gratitude and contentment. A stark contrast to the constant dissatisfaction they had felt despite all their advantages. When the afternoon ended, something fundamental had changed. It was not just reluctant acceptance or forced tolerance, but the genuine beginning of familial bonds based on mutual respect and growing affection. "Dad," Edward said at the door, "we want to be more involved. In Emmy's life, in Sarah's work, in our real family." David embraced his children with an emotion he could not disguise. "You were always welcome. You were just waiting to find your way back." Emmy waved from the window as Edward and Lily got into the car, shouting, "Bye, siblings, come back soon." That night, for the first time in months, David slept with the certainty that his family, complex, non-traditional but deeply loving, was finally complete. September arrived in New York City with its promise of spring, bringing with it the first signs of renewal that the city so desperately needed after the harsh winter. The trees began to bud again, and there was a different energy in the air, a feeling that profound changes were coming. For David Morgan, this feeling in the last 2 months, the dynamics of the Morgan family had completely transformed. Edward and Lily had become regular visitors to the charity organization, contributing not only financially, but also with their time and expertise. Edward had implemented a financial management system that tripled the efficiency of the organization, while Lily had created a free legal assistance program for families in vulnerable situations. However, a dark cloud loomed over the growing happiness of the family. During a routine checkup at the private clinic that David had hired to monitor Emmy's health, the doctors discovered something concerning. "Mr. Morgan," said Dr. Smith, the pediatric cardiologist at the local hospital, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the tests. Emmy has a congenital heart condition called ventricular septal defect. It's a small opening in the wall that separates the two lower chambers of the heart. David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Memories of Lily's illness came flooding back. Hospitals, treatments, the anguish of watching a beloved child struggle against something he could not control with money or influence. "Is it serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fortunately, no. It's a treatable condition with minimally invasive surgery. However, the procedure is delicate and expensive, approximately $300,000, including all post-operative care." David almost laughed with relief. $300,000 was an amount he could afford without even checking his bank balance. But then Dr. Smith continued, "The challenge, Mr. Morgan, is not the cost. It's the availability. There are only 2 surgeons in the United States qualified for this specific procedure, and both have waiting lists of 8 months. Emmy will need the surgery within 3 months, or the condition could significantly worsen." It was then that David understood that not every problem could be solved simply by throwing money at it. He would need to use influence, connections, and possibly make morally complex choices to ensure that Emmy received the necessary treatment in a timely manner. When he returned to the charity organization with the news, he found Emmy teaching math to a group of younger children, completely unaware of the storm approaching her life. Sarah was organizing documents at her desk, humming softly as she worked. The domestic peace of the scene contrasted violently with the medical urgency that David carried. "Aunt Sarah, Mr. Morgan." Emmy ran up to him with a new drawing. "Look, I drew our family at the wedding. You in a suit, Aunt Sarah in a white dress, me as a bridesmaid, and Edward and Lily as the best man and maid of honor." David took the drawing with trembling hands, observing the radiant happiness that the girl had captured in the simply but expressively drawn faces. How could he tell her that her health was at risk? How could he break that bubble of security they had built together? "Emmy, sweetheart," said Sarah, noticing the tension on David's face. "How about you go play in the yard while Mr. Morgan and I talk about adult things?" When they were alone, David told her everything. Sarah listened in silence, her expression shifting from fear to determination, and finally, to steely resolve. "We will find a solution," she said simply. "Whatever the cost." "Money is not the problem," David explained, "but there isn't enough money to buy time or create qualified surgeons instantly." It was then that Edward and Lily arrived for their weekly visit, finding the 2 adults deep in serious conversation and piles of medical research. "What's going on?" Edward asked immediately, his business intuition sensing a crisis. When David explained the situation, the children's reaction was immediate and surprising. Instead of panic or hesitation, they took a practical resolution stance that reminded David of the best of the Morgan family business acumen. 8-month waiting list, said Lily, pulling out her smartphone. "I'll call our legal counsel. There must be legal precedents for medical emergencies. And I'll reach out to our international network," added Edward. "We have medical partners in the United States and Germany. Maybe there are options there." Indeed, in the 3 days that followed, the Morgan family mobilized resources that David hadn't tapped into in years. Political contacts were activated, favors were called in, and a complex web of influence was set in motion. Lily discovered that the local hospital had an experimental program for pediatric emergency cases, but it was rarely used due to bureaucratic complexities. Edward found a world-renowned German surgeon who could perform the procedure, but it would cost $1 million for the surgery and travel. $1 million is not a problem," David said immediately. "Let's go to Germany." "Wait," intervened Sarah. "David, did you hear what Lily said about the local hospital's program?" "I heard, but she said it's complicated bureaucratically." "Complicated, but possible." Sarah stood up, walking to the window of the charity organization. "David, You have enough influence to open those bureaucratic doors, and if we can get Emmy operated on through the Brazilian public healthcare system, we will be paving the same way for hundreds of other children who don't have the option of going to Germany. The observation hit David like a revelation. Throughout his life, he had used his wealth to create private solutions for personal problems. But Sarah was suggesting something different, using his influence to create systemic solutions that would benefit not only Emmy, but all children in similar situations. Are you proposing that we use Emmy's illness as an opportunity for reform in the healthcare system? Edward asked, impressed by the long-term vision. I'm proposing that we do what's right, Sarah replied. Not just for our family, but for all families who will face this same problem in the future. The decision that followed was unanimous. Instead of seeking the quickest and most private solution, the Morgan family chose the more difficult but potentially more transformative path. David used his political contacts to push for the acceleration of the experimental program. Lily worked tirelessly with public health attorneys to navigate the complexities. Edward mobilized corporate resources to finance not only Emmy's treatment, but also to establish a permanent fund for similar cases. When Emmy finally learned about the situation, 2 weeks later, when a date for the surgery had already been confirmed, her reaction was typical of her generous personality. "So other kids will also be able to have surgery because of me?" she asked, her eyes shining not with fear but with pride. "Yes, Princess," replied David, hugging her. "You are helping not only yourself but many other children." "That's so cool," exclaimed Emmy. "It's like my heart is helping other hearts." That night, as the family gathered for dinner at the charity organization, a tradition that had naturally established itself, David realized that Emmy had taught them the most valuable lesson of all. True wealth was not having enough power to solve one's own problems, but using that power to solve bigger problems affecting society as a whole. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, but David already knew that, regardless of the outcome, his family had won the most important challenge, the challenge of becoming truly united for the purpose of serving something greater than themselves. October had arrived in New York City with its autumn rains, washing the city and bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch every heart in the Morgan family. Emmy's surgery had been an absolute success, not only medically but also socially. The experimental program at the local hospital had become permanent, directly benefiting 43 children in the following 2 months. It was a sunny Saturday morning when David, Sarah, Edward, Lily and Emmy headed to the jewelry store on Fifth Avenue. Finally, after 10 months of preparation, the moment had come for Emmy to try to open the safe that had initiated this extraordinary journey. "Nervous, Princess?" David asked, watching Emmy in the back seat of the car. She wore a light blue dress, specially chosen for the occasion, and carried a small backpack with tools she had studied for months with the help of Magic Pete. "A little," she admitted, her fingers playing with the backpack strap. "But it's not about opening the safe. It's about what comes after." The answer surprised everyone in the car. For months, they had assumed that Emmy was anxious about the technical challenge or the $50,000 promised. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, turning to look at her. Emmy took a deep breath with the seriousness that had become her trademark. "David, during all these months, you all taught me that the most important thing is not having money, but using money to help other people. So, if I can open the safe, I want to do something special with the 50,000. David felt a wave of paternal pride that almost made him stop the car. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to create the largest free school for homeless children in the United States," she announced with determination. "With amazing teachers, science labs, a giant library, and a special program for kids who are good at math like me." Edward and Lily exchanged glances in the front seat, both visibly moved. In recent months, they had rediscovered the meaning of family and purpose, but seeing an 8-year-old child demonstrating such social vision deeply touched them. "Emmy!" said Lily, her voice choked. "You know that even if you can't open the safe, we will help you build that school, right?" "I know," Emmy smiled, "but I want to succeed. Not for the money, but because I made a promise to David almost a year ago, and promises are important." The jewelry store was closed to the public that Saturday, opened especially for the event that had become a small sensation in the New York media. The story of the girl with the safe had captured the public's imagination, especially after details about her heart condition and the hospital program became public. Inside the store, a small crowd had gathered. Representatives from the press, some jewelry store employees, Magic Pete, who had become Emmy's official mentor in safe-cracking techniques, and surprisingly, several children from the charity organization who had insisted on being present to support their friend. The safe in question was an ornate piece from the 19th century, originally used by a family of English bankers. Its complex bronze and steel mechanisms required a combination of mathematical knowledge, mechanical skill, and infinite patience. "Well," said the jewelry store manager, a distinguished man in his 60s, "Miss Emily, the safe is your challenge. There is no time limit, and you can use any tools you brought." Emmy approached the safe with reverence, her small hands gently touching the ornate surface. For months, she had studied similar mechanisms, learned about historical gears, and practiced with replicas that David had commissioned. "First," she said, more to herself than to the audience, "I will listen to the internal sounds to understand how the pieces move." What followed was an extraordinary demonstration of concentration and skill. Emmy worked methodically, testing numerical combinations based on complex mathematical sequences, adjusting mechanisms with delicate tools, and occasionally pausing to explain her reasoning to the fascinated spectators. "This type of safe uses a modified Fibonacci sequence," she explained during a break, "but with a multiplier based on the year of manufacture. If I'm right about this being from 1887, the combination should follow this pattern." 2 hours passed. Emmy continued to work with infinite patience, occasionally accepting sips of water or words of encouragement from her family, but never losing focus. David watched every movement, remembering the first time he had seen her on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, a determined child who had accepted an impossible challenge on the condition that he would help other children. "Almost there," she murmured, her fingers delicately working with the last. "Just a little more." And then, with a satisfying click that echoed through the silent store, the safe opened. The silence that followed was broken by an explosion of applause and cheers of joy. Emmy turned to her family, her face radiant with a smile that could light up all of New York City. "I did it," she shouted, running into the arms of David. "I opened the safe." David hugged her tightly, tears of pride streaming down his face. "You sure did, Princess. You're amazing." What was inside the safe was mostly symbolic. Some historical documents, a few antique jewelry pieces, and a symbolic check for $50 million that David had prepared for the occasion. But everyone present knew that the real treasure was not inside the metal safe. "Well," David said, kneeling beside Emmy, $50 million as promised. "What do you want to do first?" Emmy looked around the store, her eyes landing on each person present, her new family, her friends from the charity organization, the strangers who had gathered to witness her moment of triumph. "First," she said with determination, "I want you to know that I didn't need to open the safe to be rich." The statement surprised everyone. "I was already rich," she continued, taking the hands of David and Sarah. "Rich because I have a family that loves me, siblings who care for me, friends who cheer for me, and the chance to help other children have the same opportunities I had." Edward approached, kneeling beside his father. "Emmy, you taught us that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in lives touched. And you showed us," added Lily, joining the group, "that family is not about blood or money, but about choosing to love and care for one another." Sarah, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, realized that the abandoned child she had found a year ago had become the catalyst for the transformation of one of the most powerful families in the country. "So," David said, standing up and extending his hand to Emmy, "are you ready to start building the best school in the United States?" "Ready!" exclaimed Emmy, taking his hand. As they left the jewelry store on that sunny October Saturday, the 5 members of the Morgan family knew they had found something more valuable than any material treasure. They had found purpose, unconditional love, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using privilege and power to create a better world. Hope Academy was inaugurated 2 years later on a 15,000-square-foot campus on the east side of Manhattan. In its first year, it welcomed 300 children in vulnerable situations, offering excellent education, 3 daily meals, comprehensive medical care, and special programs for children with high abilities in math and science. Emmy, now 10 years old, studied at the school she had dreamed of, but also dedicated her afternoons to teaching math to younger children, perpetuating the cycle of generosity that had transformed her own life. David and Sarah got married in a simple ceremony in the backyard of the charity organization, with Edward and Lily as the best man and maid of honor, and all the children from Hope for Tomorrow as special guests. The Morgan family had become not only rich in money, but rich in purpose, in love, and in the certainty that they were using their blessings to bless others. And sometimes, on Saturday afternoons, when the golden sun of New York painted the sky with impossible colors, David remembered that first afternoon on Fifth Avenue when an 8-year-old girl had accepted an impossible challenge with a simple condition that he would help other children. She had fulfilled her part of the bargain, opening not only a safe, but also the hearts of an entire family. The true treasure, David finally understood, had never been in any safe. It was in the people we choose to love, in the lives we choose to touch, and in the courage to believe that we can always choose to be better than we were yesterday.